New details emerging from FTX's bankruptcy filing, including how new CEO John Ray feels about the situation. Ray saying in part, quote, "Never in my career have I seen such a complete failure of corporate controls and such a complete absence of trustworthy financial information as occurred here." Well, joining us now is Renato Mariotti, Brian Cave Leighton Paisner partner and a former federal prosecutor, obviously coming from someone who used to represent people during the Enron downfall. This is not what you really want to hear at the moment. What is the latest on where SBF is in this process right now?
Well, look, they have new independent directors that have been appointed. There's been a filing today. Obviously, some really shocking details there. I mean, employees were submitting their expense reimbursement requests in chat with an emoji to accept or reject it. No board meetings. A billion-dollar loan to SBF himself, all sorts of red flags here. And looming in the background, of course, is an investigation by my former colleagues at the United States Department of Justice, as well as the SEC. Really, if you take a step back, SBF's Mr. Bankman-Fried's concerns here really should be on those investigations, and the bankruptcy is the least of the problems that he has at this point.
Well, Renato, when you take a look at some of the criticism here, it's certainly a scathing assessment. There's a tangled web of lending between Alameda Research and other entities. The filing also went on to say from comprised systems, integrity and faulty regulatory oversight abroad to the concentration of control in the hands of a very small group of inexperienced, unsophisticated, potentially compromised individuals. This situation is unprecedented. Talk to us just from the legal perspective, the legal troubles that SBF and FTX is facing at this point.
Yeah, to me, the number one, if I was going to break them down and say, what is the number one problem? It really appears on its face that FTX's customers and Alameda's customers were separately defrauded. In other words, FTX's customers believed that when they put their hard-earned money into that exchange, that the money would be available for their use and withdrawal at any time, and that that money was going to remain there. In fact, the documentation from FTX appears to make those affirmative representations to their customers. Of course, we know that didn't happen. Money was flowing not only to SBF personally, but to Alameda for use on a variety of investments. Separately, people investing money in Alameda were given the impression, and obviously as a hedge fund, that their money was going to be used to make investments that were helpful to them. Instead, it was being used to invest in FTT, which is, of course, the token that is used by FTX for payment of transaction costs on that exchange. So very, very concerning. It really looks like you have two separate groups here, both defrauded, and the total amount of the fraud loss could be in the multiple billions of dollars, perhaps the largest fraud we've seen since Bernie Madoff.
Mm. And Renato, adding more complexity to this, you also have this issue between the Bahamian government and the U.S. government. Obviously, creditors everywhere trying to get their piece of the pie. How does that muddy the waters?
Yeah, I think that's another layer here is that, of course, while there was a headquarters in the Bahamas, of course, the United States is going to be focused on making its victims whole, its citizens whole. There's going to be other governments, by the way, stepping in as well. It's not the case that all of the victims are in the United States. And so I think the Bahamian government, as you point out, they're going to be cooperating with these other entities. But I think there's definitely going to be a bit of a turf war. And you're going to see, I think, international cooperation to try to ensure that the victims are not only made whole, but that, there's some clawbacks and that people aren't getting themselves to the front of the line.
Renato, your dog behind you is even upset about everything that's developing out of this story. Let's talk just about how SBF has handled it so far. He has put out a number of tweets. His tweets just have not stopped. Does this potentially create even more of a legal headache for him?
Yes. In fact, my advice to Mr. Bankman-Fried is to stop talking so much. I mean, this guy is putting out tweet threads. He's giving interviews to the New York Times. He had some personal messages on Twitter in which he was admitting that all of his claims about altruism were false or misleading, that he was doing that just to curry favor. He suggested that, this multi-billion-dollar loss was due to some sort of inadvertence on his part. I recognize that he thinks that he is such a smart guy that he can talk himself out of this problem. But even if some of the things he's saying are self-serving, it's actually in his interest to say nothing, so that, a smart lawyer on his behalf in the future, when he's potentially indicted, can make some, intelligent arguments on his behalf. He's really only hurting himself here.
I mean, what, if any, sort of defense could he offer for all this as we continue to see details come out and he continues to tweet? Yeah,
the best defense for Mr. Bankman-Fried is that he was in over his head. He was inattentive. He wasn't focused on the details. He wasn't paying attention. He had no idea what he was doing. In other words, the exact opposite of the image that he was trying to portray for the last several years. But I think he needs to basically say, look, I'm this young kid, didn't really know what I was doing. I really didn't know how to run an organization like this. And, essentially do a full circle shift like that, which is not easy to do. And that's why his recent statements are so problematic for him. But that's the best he's got. And unfortunately, his best case scenario is to essentially get wiped out on the civil side. But I have to say it's very difficult for me to see at this point how there isn't at least some criminal liability for Mr. Bankman-Fried.
Indeed. Well, great getting your insights. Renato Mariotti, thank you so much for joining us this afternoon, and your dog as well.